Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and this is part 2 of my interview with Cyndi Mesmer. We are talking about intentionality. Let me begin by summarizing part 1, and then we'll return to my conversation with Cyndi. Last time, Cyndi and I talked about the importance of naming the intentionality of those who harmed us. As you begin to engage your story and name the ways that, for example, your parents harmed you, it is very common to think, okay, I'll acknowledge that my dad harmed me, but I don't think he really meant to do it. I don't think my dad was trying to be cruel. He was just pretty oblivious and clueless about how to relate to his daughter. And Cyndi and I want to respond to that sentiment by saying, really? You really want to say that your dad was clueless? And far more, what we're wanting you to grapple with is, what would it cost you to believe that your father hurt you on purpose? What would it cost you to believe that your mother said and did those things on purpose? As we pick up my conversation with Cyndi, we are talking about the fact that parents have prompts every day. Prompts. We all have prompts. For example, the family is sitting at the dinner table and mom sees that her daughter is very sad. The daughter is withdrawn, quiet. When mom sees her daughter, there is a prompt inside of mom that says, something is not right with your daughter. Why don't you ask her what is wrong? Okay, that's a prompt. That's where we left off. Here's the rest of my conversation with Cyndi. So there are tons of ways to refuse to honor a prompt, but I think 3 of the most common are mom can ignore.
Yep.
My daughter's face isn't sad.
Totally.
I'm just not going to look at it. I'm going to look at her brother.
Yep.
Mom can minimize. The sorrow on her face is just because, like you said, a boy didn't talk to her. Mm-hmm. Her heart's not really broken because something bad happened. It's just, it's minimizing. Mm-hmm. Or there can be accusation. She's too sensitive.
Yep.
And I'm not going to engage it.
Yeah.
But I'm writing the narrative of she's too sensitive. That's why her face has fallen. And all of a sudden, this process of self-deception begins to justify why mom is not being a mom.
Yeah. And I would even go so far to say, like, some of the main things that, like, what you're naming is, like, all different ways in which we're blaming the daughter. And then there's always the other pieces of, like, hey, I've worked a long, hard day, or I've had long conversations with her before. So there is this kind of balance of accusing the person and excusing your own behavior. Here's what's just really painful is that the narrative, the new narrative that's created in that parent gets fed to the child so that the child then swallows that and believes that they're either too oversensitive or not valuable, not important, or that it's their fault and that they're a burden to their parent. Like, that gets fed to that child, and that child then plays that narrative out the rest of their lives.
But what's actually happening is that the mother or father are engaged in a process of self-deception that the Bible calls the hardening of the heart.
Yeah.
And the longer the family narrative becomes that the middle daughter is just too sensitive. Mm-hmm. The longer that becomes the narrative, and dad's in on it, her 2 brothers are in on it. We all know that Sally is she's just too sensitive. It becomes the family narrative.
Absolutely.
And so her fallen face is not because of anything horrible that happened at school. Mm-hmm. It's just Sally being Sally. Mm-hmm. And now mom is justified in ignoring the countless prompts. Mm-hmm. Sally staying in her room, Sally getting involved in obsessive compulsive stuff. I mean, on and on it goes. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to address any of that. because the problem is Sally. She's too sensitive. Now self-deception is really thick, it's really justified, and it's part of the family dynamic. The more we ignore a prompt, the easier it is to ignore that prompt tomorrow.
Totally.
Like my conscience is less seared when I've made sense of it as, oh, no, she's just too sensitive.
And then she takes that with her into her relationships, into her marriage, into the way in which she interacts with her child. And then she engages, maybe she steps into a story group and she hears for the very first time, your mom intended to do that.
Yes.
On purpose.
Right. And all of a sudden, the foundations of which she has built her life crumble.
Yeah.
And she's utterly disoriented.
Absolutely.
And falling through the earth because, are you saying that I wasn't too sensitive?
Mm-hmm.
And she's oriented her entire life around this truth.
Yeah, and are you naming that, like, maybe my sensitivity was a beautiful, lovely thing?
Right.
Wait, what? Right?
Right.
And are you saying that my mom was just, like, either annoyed or envious of my brightness? And then they're like, what? There's a sense of relief and there's a sense of grief that comes with that, but there's a sense of freedom.
Right. And when your sexual assault got renamed and you got renamed, there was an onslaught of both relief and grief.
Absolutely.
And why both, Cyndi? Why both?
Yeah, because I think there's a sense of the relief is like, oh my God, I don't have to carry this lie in my body, these accusations against myself. I don't have to carry them anymore. And there's a sense of grief for that young teenage girl who was harmed deeply and was set up for that harm by the family she came from. And there's such grief for what she experienced. So that's why I say there's both a sense of relief that I don't have to carry that and just a sense of grief on behalf of what that girl endured and that she had no one tell her any different until she's like in her 40s.
Right.
Yeah.
But suddenly your life starts to make sense.
Yes. And as soon as the pieces start to fall together and it's both good and horrible at the same time, Adam. It's like just so disruptive and painful and life-giving and freedom-giving. It's both. And it sets up to go, you know what? I want to speak truth so that there's freedom. And if truth comes with like intentionality, if truth comes with that was premeditated, if truth comes with like my parents, my closest people are not who I thought they were, it does actually create space for things like forgiveness and acceptance for who they are. Yeah. It does open up space for my children to have the freedom to come and talk to me about ways in which I wounded them and harmed them. Like there is so much that comes from speaking truth.
And for today, speaking truth about how my dad wasn't oblivious, he was sexually harmful.
Yes.
Or he was intentionally withholding emotional connection from me because my mother got lots of emotional connection with me, and he's not too fond of the fact that his 12-year-old son is actually more emotionally connected to his wife than he is.
Yes.
And so it's not so much neglect that I'm experiencing with my dad, it's revenge. And when that stuff gets named, like you begin to spin inside. Mm-hmm. But your compass gets reoriented. It gets recalibrated.
Yeah, it creates a corrective experience. It creates a corrective narrative. Which then starts a ripple effect of changing a little bit of how you see and understand your history. in a way that produces freedom.
And so when Jesus says it's the truth that sets you free, he's not kidding. And it's not just the truth about the ways that you've been harmed, but it's the truth about the intentionality behind it.
Yes.
And often this is one of the last things to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things we hold on to most tightly. Okay, I'll acknowledge that my mom was emotionally way too connected to me, used me to fill her emotional needs, but I don't think she woke up in the morning and intended to do that to my 12-year-old heart.
And I would disagree.
Right. Yeah. Until I'm able to see that, I really have to believe she's a caricature of a human being. Like, I have to believe that she doesn't have the capacity for intentional, motive-driven behavior, which I believe I have.
Of course.
And everyone has.
Absolutely.
And when God talks to Israel in the Old Testament, he expects them to have. And he never says to Israel, they didn't mean to do it. Mm-hmm. Or, they were part of a generation that didn't do emotions.
Yep.
And yet we will make excuses for our parents so that we can hold on to a notion that my mother loved me.
And I think, what we started with a while ago where I'm inviting people, can you put all the other things that you know about your parents, can you just put that on the shelf for right now? And can we actually really name what's true about what you experienced? I believe that what is true is our parents have their own stories of trauma and they operate out of them. I think that's true. And I think they need help and they need care for that. But if I'm sitting in front of somebody that's telling me a story of harm, my responsibility, my loyalty, my commitment is to the person that's in front of me. And if pulling in, well, you don't understand, my mom had a really bad history, or my dad, had a bad history. If pulling that in sets up for me not to actually be able to, for us not to be able to fully name what the harm was, what the intentionality was, what that created, what the impact of that is, I'm not well with that. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some complexity to we need to attend to the person in front of us and name what is true for our own story. And it doesn't in any way negate that our parents have their own trauma stories.
It doesn't.
But what we do is we use our parents' trauma stories to negate our own.
Right. And what I often say to clients, I use it like a weapon almost every time. I simply say, you have chosen to do something very different with your pain than your mother did. And the question is, why? Yes. And it's because your heart is different than her heart. And you know it. But you don't want to know it.
You don't want to name it because it brings about so much grief.
Yeah.
And there's a cost, a very real and honest cost to naming what is true. And like you said before, the cost could be losing a specific role in a family. It could be losing your family. It could be losing a lot.
So I want to just come back to self-deception and prompts, just by way of kind of review, what we're saying. Well, here, there's an HBO show called The Tale about sexual abuse. And Laura Dern stars in it. And in The Tale, she's sexually abused as a 13-year-old girl. And there's a place in the film where she's talking to her mother years later, decades later. And they're remembering a time when Laura Dern's character comes to see mom with the man who is abusing her. And the mom says, when he came to the door, all my antenna went up. Mm-hmm. Mom ignored that prompt.
Yeah. And she sent her daughter away with a pedophile.
Yes. There has to be an honest reckoning with the fact that mom had a prompt. She's even telling it decades later, my antenna went up.
Yep.
She didn't do anything with that prompt. And if you see the film, you'll see there's a reason why. It involves her father. But the point is, she began the process of self-deception.
Yes. There are parts of us that see the prompts that our parents have and yet can't name. And so sometimes what ends up happening is we're telling a story to a therapist or a friend or in a group, and the evidence is there. The evidence of the intentionality is there. But I need someone to desperately point out that evidence to me. I need to see that, like, hey, your mom made this comment that seems to indicate that she had a prompt to keep you home. So there is a sense of like the prompt, there is evidence to support the prompts, and sometimes we need help actually naming those.
Right. Because it's our story and we were so close to it. Mm-hmm. And so we can't see it, which is why you needed your group, why you needed Trapper to point out a couple of obvious things
totally
about your mother.
Mm-hmm.
But to have the willingness to name that when he sensed that you were going to bring the wrath of God back at him if he began to go there.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And here's what's true. I believe in that moment, one, Trapper can handle my anger. I'm not worried about it. I knew he's strong enough to be able to do so. But I knew in that moment that he was telling the truth.
Right.
And I knew in that moment I didn't want to believe it. And I knew in that moment that he was for me.
Right.
Like he was so for me and cared about me enough to name what was true, knowing full well what that would bring me in regards to re-altering my story and such grief and sorrow. Like he knew it was going to bring some level of pain, but the pain was clean. The pain was about healing.
Right. And the biblical phrase for this is wounds from a friend can be trusted.
Yeah. And so there's this sense of like, thank you for having enough courage to name what was true so that I could release myself from accusation, from blame, from harm.
Right.
Like I needed that.
Yeah. And this goes into the whole category of how do you engage someone's story well? And all too often we stop with, I'm so sorry you were sexually assaulted.
And for me, that would not have been helpful.
No, it would have just reinforced everything you believed about how it was your fault in the first place.
Totally. But what I needed someone to say is, did you notice that he was scanning the area to make sure no one was around? Did you notice he took you into a secluded place? Did you notice the ways in which he talked to you, interacted with you, touched your face? Like, did you notice though? Like, even though I wrote that in my story, I needed somebody to point that out for me to be able to even name it as sexual assault decades later.
Yeah. And this is why story work is so important, because it's in the granularity. It's in the particularity. It's in the details. Mm-hmm. It's in the fact that he, not your story, don't know this story, but that he put his hand so tenderly on your cheek and said something about your artwork. And he knew that art was really important to you. Mm-hmm. And you had done an art project, and he was so attuned to how important art was to you. Yeah. And that all of these things were his way of lowering your guard of your heart and giving you, really stoking the hunger of your heart for connection. And it was all so that he might violate you.
Yeah,
And until that gets named, there's no way to name that apart from the details of a particular story.
absolutely.
If all you bring is I was sexually assaulted when I was in 7th grade, he was 16, blah, 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 it's just there's not enough data. There's not enough evidence. You can't comb the crime scene without details.
Right.
And so when I talk so often on the podcast about the importance of engaging your story and writing your stories out on the ground level, it's through the details on the ground level that a reader of your story or a listener of your story will see the evidence of intentionality.
Yeah.
You don't need to write the evidence. You just need to be faithful to the story.
Right.
They will see it.
They
You
will
will
see
not.
it. Because there's this part of us, right, Adam, that we so desperately want to be seen. We want to be caught. We want healing. We so desperately want that. And so we write it in our story and we don't even know it, right?
Right.
I mean, the particular story I'm talking about, like literally the end of the story is I'm walking away with so much accusation and shame that I carried around for being bad, from coming from like a rigid Christian home and being sexually assaulted, but not naming it as that as at all. I just felt like a horrible person. Right. And so for me to be able to read a story that then altered that narrative, like I needed other people to actually point out the particularities of that story, to the intentionality. And so it's not enough just to talk about impact. That's so horrible. Looks like you carried a lot of shame. Looks like, you turned on yourself. It's not enough for me to name impact, even though impact is so important. Like, how did you survive that? So important. But what I needed for freedom, I needed to understand the intentionality.
Yeah. And the intentionality of both the one who did the assaults and the intentionality of the lack of care from your mom and or dad that set you up to be so groomed and responsive to the grooming of this perpetrator of harm.
Yeah.
It all has to get named.
All has to get named. It's like, yes, we often say, Adam, that abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like what was the setup? What family did I come from? Where I wasn't seen all that well. And that set up for, it didn't take much for a boy or man to just be seductive and say really kind things to me, for me to feel like this intoxication feeling. And then me being excited is such a setup for me to like blame myself. If I hadn't been so excited to like go for a walk with him, like I wouldn't have got assaulted.
And so when the data gets like a spotlight shown on it, you begin to realize, oh, of course I went for a walk with him.
Yes.
Like, of course my heart was kind of beating fast.
Yes.
Like somebody gave a rip about me and was paying attention to me.
Intoxicating. Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for your kind of framework to thinking about why naming intentionality is so important. Thank you for laboring in your own story to kind of get passionate about naming intentionality, because it's pretty personal for you.
Yes, it is.
And thank you for coming on the podcast, Cyndi.
Oh, thank you, Adam. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. It's always good to be with you.
If people want to get in touch with you, if people live in Chicago or want to get connected to you, how do they do that?
So they can always go to my website, which is artoflivingcounseling.com. They can also reach me at my office number, which is 815-444-9076.
Awesome. Thanks, Cyndi.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember, new episodes release to the Place We Find Ourselves app 4 weeks before they are available on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else. So if you want to get episodes immediately, you have to go to my website and sign up for $3 a month, $30 a year. Please consider doing this. Your financial support allows me to continue podcasting. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.